Hello, you've made it to week 11. Congratulations. This week we are going to look at the first half of Bobby Ann Mason's novel In Country. The good news is, because we're splitting this novel, the presentation will probably run a little shorter than last week's, which definitely ran longer than most. So let's start by discussing Bobby Ann Mason herself. Just some background information. She was born in 1940, raised on her family's dairy farm in western Kentucky, outside of the town of Mayfield. She majored in English at the University of Kentucky, and In Country is probably her best known work. She's also known for a pretty well regarded story collection called Shiloh and Other Stories, which was published in 1982. She's also a former writer in residence at the University of Kentucky. Writer in residence is basically an author that has become successful and published enough that they are invited to sort of be the resident author for a university and expected to do readings and other activities. So for a long time, that was a role that she filled. I suppose I should mention as well that Bobby Ann Mason is still very much alive and kicking, and I believe is still publishing. I didn't mention that on the previous slide, but we have sort of entered that phase of the class where we're no longer reading about either uh, deceased or mostly retired writers. I think out of everybody we've read so far, Toni Morrison is still alive, although she is largely retired. Although she did publish a book recently, but Bobby Ann Mason still very active. Okay, let's talk a bit about In Country. It was published in 1985, set pretty much in its immediate past, 1984. A couple things about that. First of all, we haven't read a lot of novels that are set more or less when they were published. If you think about what we've looked at, um, I completely had a blank there. The last book we read, So Long, See You Tomorrow, was set 60 years before it was published, and Sula was set about the same. Winesburg, Ohio, was set, you know, I would say, depending on which story you're looking at, anywhere from 10 to 50 years before it was published. Ethan Frome mostly was set in the past from when it was published because it was largely a flashback. Oh, and Bless Me Ultima was also set, published in the 70s, set in the 40s. So, really, for the first time, we're getting a story that is set very near publication. Basically, it's a novel that was written in the present. And if you were having trouble figuring out how we knew that it was set in 1984, two of the early indicators. One are the popular music references. You can sort of tie the Bruce Springsteen reference to Born in the USA being on the radio to 1984. You can also tie the presidential election, talking about Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro being his running mate. That was the 1984 presidential election. Um, so, the novel's set in the fictional town of Hopewell, Kentucky. Basically, it serves as a stand in for Bobby Ann Mason's real hometown of Mayfield. If you look at Hopewell in this novel and compare it to the real Mayfield, Kentucky, they're very similar, located in the same general area of Kentucky. And for those of you who might be a little confused, yes, there actually is a real Hopewell, Kentucky, but the one in the novel isn't it. So, a little visual aid to help you sort the fact from fiction when it comes to Hopewell, Kentucky. This is the real Hopewell. It is just east of Louisville on I 64. And this is where the actual town of Mayfield in Kentucky is, where Bobby Ann Mason was raised. And this, generally speaking, is the region where the Hopewell of the novel is located. You'll notice just to the south and east of Mayfield is Murray, and she talks about going to Murray State. They go into Paducah, and you can see where that is in relation. So it wouldn't really make sense for the Hopewell of the novel to be a suburb east of Louisville, especially because Lexington is so far away in the novel. And so now that you've had your geography lesson for the day, let's talk a little bit about In Country as a novel. Some things to consider, keep in mind as you read the novel. First of all, you're going to see a lot, capital L, capital O, capital T, of popular and material culture referenced in this book. My recommendation to you if you haven't already figured this out, is to have Google ready, have Netflix ready, have iTunes, whatever you need to access and get a sense of these references. Some of you who maybe are my age or close to it will get more of them naturally. Um, those of you who uh, went straight from high school into college, some of this is going to be a little bit outdated for you. You might not know what, say, Hill Street Blues is. You're also going to get a lot of references to the Vietnam War and some references to national politics, the '84 election, as I mentioned, and a few other things. Here, I think it's useful to have Wikipedia handy. You're going to see references to specific places in Vietnam, specific aspects of Vietnam. Agent Orange, for example. It really is your responsibility as a critical reader to find this information and use it to help you understand what's happening in the novel. The novel is often not going to do it for you. Um, this is also an important text for sort of our continuing discussion of rural people who want to stay put versus rural people who can't wait to leave. If you think back to really anything we've looked at, Ethan Frome wants to leave Starkfield. Um, George Willard is happy in Winesburg until the end of the novel, but other characters in Winesburg want to get away. Um, whereas Antonio in Bless Me Ultima seems fairly happy in his small rural community. Um, this is another important one. This is a book that is very much about, in some ways, Sam wanting desperately to get out of Hopewell, and yet there are certain things that she would actually rather stay in Hopewell than do. For example, go to college in Lexington. Um, so I think maybe this is the most nuanced exploration so far of the small town person who wants to get out of that town versus the one who sees the value. And I think Sam is, to some extent, maybe not equally so, but to some extent both of those. Um, Finally, this is yet another version of the South that we have seen. Um, so keep that in mind as we continue to look at these different rural cultures. Okay, so let's get into the actual novel. I didn't divide it into chapters because the chapters are just numbers and there are so many of them that that starts to lose meaning. So basically, I divided the slides into discussions of part one, uh, part two, and I believe part three. Um, this week, we're only going to get to parts one and two. So, first of all, this is a frame story. All of part one actually happens almost at the end of the chronological story. And then when part two begins, we flash all the way back to the beginning of the summer and slowly watch the events that lead up to the trip that the characters are on at the beginning of part one occur. So, this is what we call a frame story. It's framed on both ends by a present moment, but in the middle we flash back to a long, lengthy period of the past. What effect does this have on you as a reader? I don't think there is one answer, but frame stories certainly get us interested. You get a little taste of what's happening right now, and then you start to wonder why this is happening, and then the story flashes back to help you understand that. I also think this structure is useful because the entire novel is sort of about how well we can understand the past, and then the entire novel, or most of the novel, is set in that immediate past, or in an immediate past. So be aware, not that it's hugely important to understanding the novel, but it's a device that Bobby Ann Mason chooses to use to affect you, the reader, so you need to be conscious of what effect it's having. So, almost immediately in part one, we are hit, as I mentioned we would be, with consumer and popular culture references. So, just at the very beginning of the novel, we get Kent Cigarettes, Exxon, Chevron, Sunoco, Country Kitchen, McDonald's, Stuckey's, National Lampoon's Vacation, Pepsi, Volkswagen, Motown, HBO, Springsteen, The Doors, Howard Johnson's, Trans Am, Ford Cobra, Buick, Saab, Visa, Walkman, Mountain Dew, Talking Heads, The Beatles, Holiday Inn, 7-Eleven, Coke, Hill Street Blues, Old Crow, Johnny Carson, Joan Rivers, Boy George, Willie Nelson, Roach Motel, Don Rickles, and Moon Pies. What's up with this? Not to sound like Jerry Seinfeld, but why are we overwhelmed with this? Think of all of the books that we've read up to this point. Very little interest in these sorts of brand names. Why are they suddenly showing up in this novel? And what do they tell us about Sam, her family, and where she comes from? Nobody says soda. Nobody says generic soda pop or soft drink. It's always Pepsi. Um, so this tells us a few things, and I think it's important to view this as very intentional on the part of Bobby Ann Mason. First of all, it tells us that we're in the 80s. We have now passed the demarcation line, the transition into true consumer culture in the United States. Right? Most of the novels we've read up to this point, well, I think all of the novels we've read up to this point are pre 1950. It's not that brands didn't exist, but it's that we were not constantly bombarded with them through the media and through cable TV, um, and through the radio. And suddenly they're everywhere. And this is also important in understanding Sam because she is raised in this environment. You'll notice in this novel, Sam tries to use songs and TV shows and movies to make sense of things that are not media, right? So to try to make sense of the war by watching MASH, for example. Um, Now, we can certainly discuss how fruitful that is, how actually probably obviously not very productive it is to try to think because you watch MASH you understand what actually happened in Vietnam. First of all, MASH wasn't even about Vietnam. It was about the Korean War, but thematically it was about Vietnam. Um, so that tells us something about Sam as a character. Um, but I think it also is particularly important in studying rural culture because a lot of these sorts of consumer driven items uh, are more notable, more valued in rural communities, right? So not that people in New York City in the 80s didn't know what Chevron and Sunoco were. They didn't know what Springsteen was, but there are so many things to do, so many distractions, such an onslaught um, of popular culture and media in urban locations um, that they are, I would say, in the 80s or even today, a little less central to daily life. Whereas in rural locations, if you think of Sam in this small town in western Kentucky, um, there's not a lot to do here. And so drifting to the media, drifting to turning on HBO and cable, drifting to the radio is a way to fill time in a place where there's not as much to do. And so the relative value placed on these things goes way up in this rural environment because they are more central to daily life. So not only is this important for understanding Sam, but I think it's important to understanding rural culture generally uh, after a certain point in American history when so much can be commodified and exported to these small towns. And I would argue that today it's even worse. Think of the internet. Think of what the internet has brought to small towns. And again, not that it hasn't brought it to rural places, but that shift is less jarring. You know, yes, people in New York City can get on Amazon.com and order anything they want, but people in New York City could get on the subway and go buy anything they wanted 50 years ago. Suddenly, in a rural place, uh, the ability to have access to what the internet offers uh, fundamentally alters the structure of sort of rural culture and rural consumerism. And to some extent, the same is happening here in the 80s, not the internet, but media in general. Ooh, that last slide was a long one. This one will be shorter. We get this passage on page 7 about Sam. She is nearly 18 years old and out to see the world. She would like to move somewhere far away, Miami or San Francisco maybe. She wants to live anywhere but Hopewell. If this seems familiar, it's because this is that character, the person who is raised in the small town and cannot wait to get out. What, though, bothers Sam particularly about Hopewell? And I think part of the problem here is what she perceives as the closed mindedness of the community. Certainly, they don't view Emmett the way that she does. Of course, Emmett, I think, brings some of that on himself by being sort of truly eccentric. Um, but she wants to get out and experience the world. And it's not just this idea of the world she wants to experience, like Sula did, or like some of the characters in Weinsberg did. It's a version of the world that she is regularly being exposed to through the radio, through television, through HBO and cable TV. Um, she sees a world through the media that she is not actually in. So, in some ways, her desire to leave is predicated on a much more specific sense of what's out there than characters that we have seen earlier. So, the character of Mama, which is a very, I think, Midwestern and Southern term for a grandmother generally, serves sort of as a foil to Sam in this first part. And actually, when part two starts, we don't see Mama for quite a while until we get almost to the end of part two and back into the present moment in part three. But one of the things the frame does is expose us to Mama earlier so that we can get a sense of not only her as a character, but how she serves as a foil to Sam. And all I mean by that, if you don't know the term dramatic foil, is sometimes characters are put in stories to help us understand other characters. So because we get this novel through Sam's eyes and through Sam's voice, look at her description of Mama here. She says, Mama hasn't traveled much. When they stopped on the parkway the day before to eat, Mama didn't even know what the little tubs of non-dairy creamer were. Now, basically what we have here is the stereotype of the country bumpkin, right? The country person who just doesn't understand the world. But that's useful to compare to Sam, who through the media and through the things that she hears and sees and reads, feels like she does understand the world, even though her understanding of things like the Vietnam War, we come to realize, are not as self-aware as she thinks they are. So what's the suggestion here about life in Hopewell? Well, that it's isolated. The Mama doesn't have any reason to have come across little tubs of non-dairy creamer. And why is Sam different? Because she does understand the world through the media, or at least believes that she does. And that really is where the focus on popular culture becomes important in this story. And we also learn a couple of pages later that, quote, Sam shudders at the idea of growing up on a farm, doing chores, never getting to town. And this is an important moment for us to understand Hopewell. Right? So Hopewell is not the middle of nowhere. Hopewell, as small towns go, is probably on the larger side of the small town. We learned that they don't have a mall, for example, but they have a shopping center with a J.C. Penney's, right? So we're not in the middle of nowhere, like the people outside of town, which is where Mama lives, right? Mama, Sam's father's mother, and her husband live on a farm outside of Hopewell. So again, we get sort of that town-country dichotomy that we have seen in other books. So here we have one of the, I point them out in every book, the passages that just seem really thematically and symbolically resonant for the text as a whole. In part one, we get one of those. They're at the hotel on their way where they're going, and Sam is watching the interstate traffic go by. Now keep in mind that while Hopewell is close to an interstate, the interstate as a whole is not something that Sam would have spent a lot of time on. So to suddenly see all of this traffic on this large four-lane highway would be very interesting to Sam and certainly to Mama and to some extent even to Emmett, although he's seen more of the world than the other two have. And we get this passage. Everything in America is going on here, on the road. Sam likes the feeling of strangeness. They are at a crossroads. The interstate with traffic headed east and west, and the state road with north-south traffic. She's in limbo, stationed right in the center of this enormous amount of energy. The whine of the diesel trucks is like the background of a rock song. So we're actually at a hotel, and I'm sure we've all seen these, where two major highways meet. And this passage is important because it tells us something about Hopewell, that in Hopewell you do not see this sort of traffic or this sort of movement or this sort of energy. It also tells us something about the 1980s, that Americans have gotten more and more mobile. Right? If you think about it, the interstate highway system didn't even exist in this country until I believe the 1950s. So we're only 20 years after that. So really we're at a moment where Americans have started to figure out that they're not defined by place in the way they absolutely were in Sula and Ethan Frome and Weinsberg. And so there's a lure to this sort of mobility for Sam that ties into both her as a character and to the 1980s as a time period. Okay, so that's the end of part one. Part two begins by flashing all the way back to the beginning of the summer. Sam in Hopewell. Um, she's starting to think about going to college. Um, we don't even know Mama as a character yet, except from the flashback in part one. She's living in this house with Emmett. Her mom actually lives in Lexington, which is, if you remember the map, fairly far away, with Sam's new baby sister and Sam's stepfather. Sam's father died in the war, and she never knew him. So everybody sort of moved on with life, and Sam sort of lives in this strange limbo, this strange liminal place where she lives with Emmett, her mom's brother, who was in Vietnam. And as part two starts to unfold, we learn that Sam is becoming very interested in the Vietnam War. Um, so Sam is late in high school, and while she would have been alive during parts of the Vietnam War, she's too young to remember it. Her only sense of Vietnam is through memory, through uh, cultural memory, the stuff she sees on TV, the stuff she hears people talk about. She has no firsthand experience with it. So, why is she becoming interested in Vietnam? Well, one is she believes that Emmett was exposed to Agent Orange. And because he has pimples, because he has headaches, she thinks that Agent Orange, which was a defoliant that wasn't very healthy, has started causing him problems. And even though this doesn't seem as important early in the book, Sam is also interested in the Vietnam War because that's where her father died. He died having never seen Sam. I believe that certainly Sam has no memory of him, and he never got home to see her after she was born, before he was killed. So these are the two sort of driving factors for Sam's interest in the Vietnam War. And she attempts to process all of these thoughts in a few different ways. One, by talking to Emmett and asking him questions. Two, by watching MASH, which is a TV show about um, the Vietnam War, even though it's actually set in the Korean War. And listening to songs like Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, which is a song about a guy who went to Vietnam and came back home, tried to find a job, didn't have a lot of luck. Um, Now, she's sort of using what's available to her. I mean, I guess you could go to the library and read history books, but what are the dangers of this approach? Well, one is that the picture of Vietnam she's getting is largely a constructed picture. Certainly in Born in the USA and MASH. Not that those aren't good, that's not a good song or a good TV show, but they are constructed things. They are not the real event. Um, it's like people who watch even a documentary on, say, the Civil War. Ken Burns had a famous one of those years ago that's still amazing. But if you watch it and you think to yourself, now I know what it's like to have been in the Civil War, sorry, you're wrong. That is not the case. And so the danger here is it leads Sam to thinking she understands more than she does. Emmett is a different thing. Emmett was there. And so Emmett might be able to share things, but Emmett is very coy about what he's willing to talk about. And so Sam picks up the little pieces of things that he mentions and tries to make sense of them without having them clearly explained. So that is its own danger. And she actually uses MASH and Born in the USA and other popular culture items to try to assign significance to things Emmett hints at. So she's constructing an understanding in a way that might not be the most productive. So, another aspect of the small town that we recognize, but we see again here, is the effect of rumor and sort of gossip. Right here, it takes, or it sort of aims itself toward Emmett, who, granted, is a strange guy. Um, Harmless for the most part, but unusual, especially for a small town in Kentucky in the 1980s. We get this. There were lots of stories floating around about Emmett. Emmett was the leading dope dealer in town. Emmett slept with his niece. Emmett lived off his sister. Emmett seduced high school girls. He had killed babies in Vietnam. Now, we know where we've seen this before. We've seen rural gossip, I think, in every book we've read. Um, but what do we know about Emmett? Well, we know that he is sympathetic because we're getting him through Sam's eyes. We suspect that none of these things are true. In fact, we sort of know that they're not true. We also learn that Emmett really wants to see an egret, a bird that he remembers seeing in Vietnam. What do we make of this desire to see the egret again, because he clearly makes it sound like Vietnam was not enjoyable. So why would he want to see something that he connects with Vietnam, that reminds him of Vietnam? Also, why is he so weird if the other vets in town, quote, had adjusted perfectly well? We meet many of the other vets who seem much more normal. So I don't think we can just assume Emmett is bizarre because he went to Vietnam. So I think Emmett enjoys, to some extent, being the town oddball. And he enjoys sort of the effect that has on the town, making the town itself sort of uncomfortable. And to some extent, I think we've seen those characters before, certainly in Weinsberg, for example. So, as any rural novel does, In Country makes use of familiar rural types and tropes. I don't know that I would go so far as to say stereotypes for the most part, because these are fairly well developed and interesting characters, but certainly we see rural types that are familiar to us. For example, Lonnie, um, Sam's boyfriend. He was a big sports star in high school, but he doesn't have much going for himself now, right? There's actually, speaking of Bruce Springsteen, a Bruce Springsteen song about that called Glory Days. And that is familiar because it happens a lot, right? The small town person who did well on a sports team or did well in some way in their younger years in a small town, and then never quite recapture that glory, and maybe just mostly live to try to recapture that glory. We also get driving around on back roads, which, at least in the rural environment I grew up in, was a big part of town. So was cruising around town. Both of them might be less popular now because gas is so much more expensive. But ask yourself, what else do you see here um, that would be a familiar rural type? And also, once again, we see education feeding into the plot. Sam thinks she might want to go to college. The obvious choice for her would be to go to the University of Kentucky in Lexington because that's where her mom lives, but she really doesn't want to do that. She thinks she might go to Murray State, which is much closer to Hopewell, but mostly she doesn't seem too worried about going to college, or even if she's going to go to college. And this again is something that we see in rural cultures, less of a value on continued formal education. And I think this novel helps illustrate the fact that that is not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't make someone unintelligent. Sam seems pretty bright, whether she wants to go to college or not. So it suggests there are different types of knowing and learning. And rural cultures often value maybe some of the less formal ones. Okay, and part two, also, we have a section that starts with Sam running. In fact, if you want to take out your textbook or your novel, if you have it handy, and look over pages 75 through 80, and the beauty of an online presentation is you can push pause and take a look if you like. But this would be a great section for a close reading, maybe in an exam, maybe in a paper. And just look at it and ask yourself, what's important in this section about Sam, maybe about Hopewell. We get sort of a view of the town here that's very interesting. We get, for example, that there are manicured streets in the subdivision that had recently been a cornfield. So development. One of the few small towns we've read about so far that seem to be growing rather than contracting. Right? We get more about cruising, which I already mentioned. We also get that Emmett is disillusioned with the government. And this, of course, leads to the typical question of what is sort of a conventional rural attitude toward the government. I mean, these days we get it a lot. There is a respect for the government in many rural places, for tradition and sort of what the government represents. But I think it's also usually tempered by a fairly strong distrust for the current government and what it may or may not be doing. To some extent, this is contradictory, but it's not an uncommon point of view to find in rural cultures, and we see it personified here through Emmett. So I think by the time we get to page 78, we're starting to understand Sam's fascination with Vietnam. And part of it is we get this passage where she says, "My daddy died over there right before I was born, but everybody acts like it's a big secret. I don't know much about him." So I think one thing worth considering is that Vietnam and Sam's interest in Vietnam is really Sam's desire to know her father, to know what he did there. Um, so while I don't think it's fair to say Sam's not really interested in the Vietnam War, I think she's interested in it for a very specific reason, and that is to understand the father that she never got a chance to know. And then we also have Tom's attitude toward Vietnam, one of the other vets. For example, he says that's all in the past, as if he's sort of happy to be done with it. But then he says, sometimes I feel homesick for those memories. So there's sort of a contradiction in Tom as well, that he's thankful to no longer be in the war, and yet he is oddly nostalgic for the time there. And I think part of this can be explained by sort of the Band of Brothers attitude toward war. It's not the war and the fighting itself that soldiers often miss, it's the camaraderie and the closeness with their fellow soldiers. Um, but I think this also is symbolically reflective of the rural, and how rural culture tends to always sort of have an ability to look back on the past through sort of rose colored glasses. Certainly more fully than Tom does here with the war, but they are, I think, generally similar attitudes. And in discussing not only the war, but the attitude in Hopewell toward the war and the people coming back from it, I think we learn a little bit about Hopewell and also maybe about rural culture more generally. So, Tom says, for example, the thing is, they never spit on us here. And I guess I should stop and explain. Um, some of you may not be familiar with this, but when vets would return from Vietnam, because of the sort of anti war movement and the sort of cultural zeitgeist of the 1960s and 70s in this country, um, returning soldiers were not always treated very well by the Americans they were returning to. And they were actually spit on and called baby killers, and lots of stuff that seems really sort of awful and maybe unfair to us today. But he says, the thing is, they never spit on us here in Hopewell. They treated the vets okay because the anti war feeling never got stirred up good around here. But that means they've got a notion in their heads of who we are. And that image just don't fit us at all. Around here, nobody wants to rock the boat. Think about that last line. We've talked about that, how in rural places it's less about getting to the bottom of things, less about facing uncomfortable truths than it is keeping the peace. In this case, not rocking the boat. They don't want to know what actually happened in Vietnam. They just want to treat the people coming back okay and leave it at that. And he even says here, everybody's looking backward to old timey days, antiques, and Civil War stuff. So this is exactly the sort of wistfully looking back on the olden days, so to speak, that many rural locations prefer. Right? If you've ever traveled through this or other parts of the South, there is sort of an interest in things like the Civil War and these historical events that have been over for a very long time. And I don't think it's necessarily a political interest. I think it is just a sense of history and tradition and culture, and a lot of rural communities view the past as maybe better, maybe admirable. Certainly, that's not always accurate, but that is, again, sort of a cultural quality of many rural places in the United States. So, a little bit later in the novel, Sam goes over to Lonnie's house and has dinner with her parents. And they talk about a lot of things, and it gives us a chance to get a sense of the people and the culture of Hopewell. But eventually, the discussion comes around to the war. And Lonnie's dad, Bud, had been born and sort of grew up in between major wars. So he didn't go to war the way his dad and his grandfather did. And he says, I was lucky, I guess, to be between wars, but I never felt right about it. My daddy and his daddy both fought, and I felt like I missed out on something important. Now that might feel very strange to say that by not having to go fight a war you missed out on something, and yet because American culture generally, I think, but certainly rural American culture, places a high value on having served and having gone to war. Um, Bud is implying that he does feel like he missed out on something. And Sam's reply, very sort of sarcastic teenager, she says, I don't get it. If there wasn't a war for 50 years and two whole generations didn't have to fight, do you mean there should have been a war for them? Is that why we have wars? So guys won't miss out? Now, Sam's being a bit of a brat here, obviously, But I think her point is valid, that there is this belief that war is like a coming of age, I guess, for men and for American men and for rural American men. And Sam, as a female, uh, is pointing out that this is a weird sort of double standard, and this value placed on killing men, killing other men, is misplaced at least, and probably sort of not right. Um, so I think this exchange reveals a lot about war and attitudes toward it, both generally and sort of in a gender specific way, but also in a rurally specific way. So eventually, Sam's mom comes to town, and they do several things, she and Emmett and Sam. But one of the things they do is they leave Hopewell for an evening, and they go to Paducah. And I don't know if you're familiar with Paducah, Kentucky. It's a decent sized city. It's not, Chicago or something, but I mean, it's got a lot there. It's got a mall, as Sam says. And it says, in discussing Paducah, it says the merchants in Hopewell were trying to save downtown from the attractions of the shopping center and the Paducah Mall. The idea being that Paducah, having more to offer than Hopewell, draws people away from Hopewell. As an example, Sam and Irene and Emmett go to Paducah. They eat ribs. They have a good time. And I would ask you to be critically thinking about what's happening here that is endemic or unavoidable, I guess you could say, for smaller towns, right? If you grew up like I did in southern Indiana, I grew up close to small towns, Petersburg, Jasper, other places you may have never heard of. But if we wanted to do something, go to the movies, go to the mall, whatever, we drove to Evansville. And that's so common where I come from that they've actually built an interstate that runs from my part of the state to Evansville. Will eventually reach all the way to Indianapolis. So one of the real challenges that face small towns and is being illustrated here is that people don't want to stay in them. Not just in the I can't wait to get out of here way that Sam and other characters we've seen consider, but also in the like I can't wait to get out of here for the evening, right? They can't wait to go do something somewhere where there are things to do. And of course, the more that happens, the less money stays in the town, the less the town is able to improve itself, and the more you have closed shops, boarded up windows. Um, so while it's not central, maybe, to this novel, I think it characterizes this problem fairly well. So another thing we get in part two, uh, Sam's friend Dawn finds out that she's pregnant, and it becomes sort of a background plot thread throughout the section. And it's particularly relevant, I think, to a novel about a small town because, while certainly young girls and women get pregnant everywhere, um, it's a little bit of its own thing in a small town, partially because everybody knows everybody and gossip spreads, and partially because there already are less opportunities in a place like this. So uh, a situation like an unexpected pregnancy for a single mother um, maybe weighs down even more on them. But in trying to make sense of it, we get this interesting description of Sam. It says Sam thought about how it used to be that getting pregnant when you weren't married ruined your life because of the disgrace. Another reference to sort of social mores and how everybody has a sense of everyone and maybe judges each other in small towns. It says now it just ruined your life and nobody cared enough for it to be a disgrace. Now we can debate whether Sam's view of pregnancy here is accurate or not. But I find it very interesting that Sam wants to understand war, but already feels like she understands pregnancy fine, even though she's never been pregnant. And I wonder if you can decide what this tells us about Sam. And I think it tells us a lot, but one thing it tells us is she's focused on what the media is bringing her and the far off view of the world she thinks she's getting through it, and sometimes isn't as aware of the actual world of Hopewell around her. She's sort of dismissive of local problems, is more interested in larger problems. And I think that can happen in a small town where everything feels so familiar and boring and uninteresting. It's easy to belittle, intentionally or not, and I don't think Sam's being intentional here, um, the problems of those around her. And we finally make it to the last slide for this week, and it culminates with sort of the culminating activity of the first half of the novel, which is the dance for the vets that has been planned. And it seems almost quaint and sweet and a little awkward to us today reading about it, but it's taken very seriously by a lot of the people there. Um, and I would ask you to consider what aspects of this dance seem most significant. So certainly on the level of character, Sam flirting with Tom is important. It's a little weird because he's older than she is, but it helps us understand Sam. The conversations between Sam and the vets, we start to get more of a sense of the effect of Vietnam on these small town vets that return because Sam keeps sort of interrogating them. Also, on a purely practical level, the term in country is introduced as a term. In country refers to when soldiers were in the country of Vietnam, right? As opposed to not yet having been deployed or being deployed somewhere other than Vietnam. In country meant in Vietnam. We also get that Sam longed for the 60s. Now, Sam's 18 and it's 1984. So Sam was born in 1966-ish. So how could she long for the 60s? When the 60s ended, she would have been 4. She has no real memory of it. So what's being suggested here? And I think what's really important, and maybe the general thought to leave you with here is, once again, we are seeing this wistfulness, this longing for the rural past, right? Sam, in trying to know the father she never knew, and trying to get answers from Emmett that make him make more sense, and trying to understand her sort of complicated and enigmatic mother, she finds that her interest lies more in the 60s than in the 80s, even though she has to use the media and other tools available in the 80s to try to make sense of it. And the danger, of course, is, MASH is a TV show. Born in the USA is a song. They are not artifacts of that earlier time, and it's all she really has. So, we sort of end on that note. We do also get the fight between Pete and Earl, which I think simply sort of personifies or symbolizes that, the vets that return are still dealing with things and trying to make sense of them. But I think we end part 2, or not really part 2, but the first half of the novel, this week's discussion, by saying that Sam is trying to find something in this town that she was not here for and that she can't quite make sense of. So we'll see where that goes next week. Once again, I appreciate your attention. Certainly send any questions my way, and I will see you in the presentation next week.